Hi, it's Paige from the Magic of Horsecraft, and I have some music today. I have a playlist that reflects Vikinghood, and I'm going to post the playlist later and attach it to this for those that have Amazon. So for those of you who don't know Shelby, while I'm letting people sign in, letting them warm up, I'll say the little bit that I do know about her. She doesn't care what you think, so I don't need to try to impress you. She just cares that you know facts about how horses learn and that you are willing to question what you knew and were taught that seemed to work, that required dominance theory and pressure and release. So this is a young woman who has started out traditionalist in a traditionalist sport, in the contract with the horse that says, I will keep applying pressure until you give. And then she went to school, followed her curiosity, and we'll let her tell more of her story. But she became educated in a way she couldn't look back from. And she changed how she approached her horses, and her horses' behaviors changed. So today we're going to look at what does it take to examine everything you believe to be true that has worked for you so far, that has maybe even won you buckles, trophies, medals, accolades, followers. Can you question that? What does it take? How do you reapproach something you thought you knew well, that you thought you were an expert in, with a beginner mind? So these are some of the things that we're going to look at today with Shelby, who runs Milestone Equestrian. You can find regular, articulate, well-documented and researched posts. Be prepared to be a reader, although they do make lots of reels and whatnot as well. And at the center of it are always our positive methods, and often pictures of themselves in previous incarnations with less happy horses. And these posts elicit gunfire everywhere. um, you can learn by following this person how to withstand gunfire and find your people. And so I intend to find out a bit more about what having that thick skin, that understanding, unequivocal brain science has given her, as well as some things that may be more just innate to who they are in their generation. So I'm going to pause at this point and let some others join us and find Shelby's voice for a word of their own. If you're an adult amateur horse lover who wonders what it takes to make magic with horses, you're in the right place. I'm Paige Lockton, and this is the Magic of Horsecraft. Join me for conversations with wizards in the world of horsecraft about the ingredients needed to build connection with horses and courage in life. Turns out these things are connected. How do I know? Like most things, I learned the hard way. I lost the magic I once had with horses. In regaining it, I discovered that the elements of connection are learnable. Whether you ride your horses forwards, backwards, or sideways, stick around for stories that show us how we are the same and that anything is possible. Take a chance. I have a whole playlist that I want to include in something that I put out that is like these
Why
Viking
is
songs
that?
that came on that reminded me of you.
Oh,
Young Viking. So that's kind of how I'm positioning you. It's kind of how I think of you.
as a Viking.
Yeah, young Viking, modern day Viking of the horse world. Taking one on the chin for the team, going, lighting a match and throwing it over your shoulder, going, whatever.
Yeah. Well, thank
Um,
you.
and I think of it as something larger than just like how to train horses. That part of what you're like throwing a match over your shoulder and walking away from is the patriarchy and its dominance theory, and it's all the bullshit that we grew up with rolled into one, applied to how do we train horses, right?
I agree with that. Yeah, I think that a lot of how people perceive horses has to be like people would argue with me until they're blue in the face about this, but you perceive it through the lens that you grew up in regardless, like you, and it starts before you're even around horses for a lot of people. So I think it's all connected, and I think people refusing to make that connection kind of perpetuates a lot of issues.
Most people just they can't make the connection yet somehow. So,
No.
you know, it's interesting to me because it seems like you don't care that people explode on impact with the information you put out. That's a them thing. It seems like I don't know how much it actually affects under your skin.
Like it's definitely and like I'd say it's less about it necessarily impacting my self-esteem. I find it annoying because like some people the way that they go about disagreeing with me is reliant on them, in my opinion, deliberately trying to misinterpret what I say, take things out of context, claim that I've said things or believe things that I don't. And I find that part frustrating because I think that I do articulate myself quite clearly 99% of the time. Like everyone has lapses in their ability to explain things and where there could be need for more clarity, but I'd say most of the time I say what I mean and I mean what I say. And I find it frustrating. And I guess this kind of plays into what you're saying about like societal perceptions. I find it really annoying when people add context to things that wasn't put there because then you're projecting your own context onto it when the person who put that information out there isn't doing that.
Mhm.
Um, so I'd say I find that part the most frustrating, but it's honestly just like an annoyance. It's not really like where I take what those people say to heart because the way I view it is that if they're that annoyed by what I say and it frustrates them that much, clearly there's a part of them that does believe there's some truth to it because a lot of the times they'll just tell me I'm stupid and that I don't know what I'm talking about and then I'm just a loser or whatever. And it's like, if you truly believed all of those things, you wouldn't be letting me live rent free in your head and coming back to my page again and again to comment on my content. And that's kind of the overarching theme that I notice because they're always coming to my page. I'm not going to their pages to go and argue with them. Um, I very rarely make comments on other pages. Like I'll sometimes do one or two, but it's not in the same line where like there's this man that's been on my page for the last 3 days who's made probably over 100 comments trying to argue his point. And it at the end of the day, if you truly believe that what you're doing is right and that you're not harming horses in any way, why do you need to waste so much of your own time and energy to prove to people that that's the case? Because there is an underlying guilt there, I think. And like I say that as someone who used to be in that state and did the same thing. So that makes it easier to deal with, for sure.
Yeah, I think that's the key here because so some of what I talked about in the introduction was what happens when we hit someone's shame button. And for the most part, people aren't willing to go through the feeling of shame to get to the other side of changing a behavior and having
Mm-hmm.
accountability, and aren't provided an avenue and an example of how to do so. So I think by owning our past, so I've done a similar version of going, yeah, blood on my hands. This is what used to be normal. This is what we have normalized. And I
Mm-hmm.
like to highlight, if people look at my page, they will see highlights of yours, where you have highlighted evidence in the industry of rewarding the things that now everyone can unequivocally look at and say, well, that's a pain face. And that's, you can even grade it, right? We've got a tool now.
Mm-hmm.
You can give it a grade and it's getting rewarded. And so
Yeah.
I love that. I grew up under the shadow of don't speak against the people who can make decisions that affect your future page. You may need them. And you're like, whatever. Hello, FEI. Here's
Yeah.
some pictures of what you're rewarding. I like that's
Yeah.
young Viking. That's what gets you the young Viking
Well,
status.
and like I've hit the point, like now I can be a little less afraid of that. Like I'd say earlier on, I did have to worry about it because if they came for me, I didn't have like the following I do now. But like kind of the mindset I operate with now is if they did try to like come for me and like ruin my career because they don't like my content when I'm not breaking any laws or anything like that, I could use that to my advantage to be like, hey, look, now the FBI is trying to do a smear campaign on me
Yeah,
because
they
of the
won't.
stuff that I've said. They won't do it because it would actually help my cause. It might hurt me initially, but I think in the long run, if I could actually prove these people are trying to come for my career and ruin my life because of what I'm saying,
No, they won't.
it would incriminate them. And same with like a lot of other people, it ends up backfiring on them because I have had a few trainers who haven't liked my content that like a lady a few weeks ago tried to give my page bad reviews and it ended up backfiring on her because then it sends everyone to her page and they can see the content for themselves and be like, okay, well, we can see that you're doing the things that are being criticized on this page. And then it just ends up bringing you more bad press. When if they, again, if they truly don't think they're doing anything wrong, there's no, you don't need to prove yourself. Like I've had people try to come for me and like my care of my horses too. And they don't have to agree with everything because like I live in the Pacific Northwest. A lot of the reason people come for me is like, oh, well, there's mud. And it's like, yeah, I live in a rainforest.
Yeah.
There is indeed mud here because it rains almost every single day all winter. But like so long as your horses have shelter and dry places to stand, it's like if they want to go frolic in the mud, that's none of my business. They don't have to if they don't want to. And also just like monitoring for any health issues that could arise because of that. Because it's like anywhere you live, climate wise, there's always going to be factors that you need to take into consideration, and you're going to have to adjust their care practices accordingly. But regardless of where you live, for example, stalling your horse 24/7 and isolating them from other horses is always going to be damaging, regardless of the weather, even if you have a good reason. Even if the reason is there's an ice storm outside and all of the roads and like the fields are completely iced over, it's still damaging to their welfare. There's not really, just because it's necessary in that aspect doesn't mean that it's not damaging. Even for like
Right.
stall rest, for example, it's still damaging.
So
It
still own
doesn't
the
matter if
damage.
there's like
Don't
an
disown the damage.
exactly.
Just because,
And
yeah.
then that, yeah, that's also like a pet peeve of mine too, where it's like you don't have to be providing perfect care, but it's like if you're trying to make yourself feel better by being in denial of where there's deficits in care, then you don't stand a chance to try to improve on those or do what you can to mitigate them in your power. Like if you have your horse on stall rest, but you're denying the fact that it's impacting their welfare at all, then you're less likely to be considerate enough to be like, I'm going to go take my horse to hand graze. I'm going to get them more enrichment for their stall. And like, I think that's my bigger pet peeve. It's not like, because people think that I have this mindset where it's like, I'm just like punishing people, even if they're doing the best that they can. But it's like, to be blunt, you're not doing the best that you can if you don't have the self-reflection capacity to look at the care that you're providing and use evidence-based practices to see like where there might be deficit. Like where I live too, a lot of the boarding facilities here only offer stall and paddock turnout, and it's very difficult to find group turnout because of, again, because it's a rainforest, there's not always a ton of space that doesn't get muddy. So like in order to do that, oftentimes you have to sacrifice having an indoor arena, for example. But in my opinion, choosing to ride in the rain or not be able to ride all winter is the more ethical decision if the benefit is for your horse, because otherwise, again, there's no way around the fact that you're prioritizing riding. And I think that that's also something that I get stuck on, where it's like people basically they want to be able to make selfish decisions, but they also want to be able to make those decisions without any judgment and without actually having to look at what those decisions mean. And I get that that's hard to do, but you can't have both of those things. You can't make deliberately selfish decisions and then have no one notice that and comment on it, because like I've done the same thing too. Like for years when I was showing, having an indoor arena was the priority, even if the quality of care for the horse was quite bad. um and like it, and even in cases where it's like if your horse injures themselves and it's a career-ending injury, if you choose to sell them or give them away to someone else after that, they're not really like your heart horse then, because as soon as they're not rideable, their value is effectively gone. And Again, that's something I would have used to have defended in the past, where I'd be like, no, I still like love my horse. It's not just about riding. I just can't afford like an unrideable horse and a rideable one. But it's like, yeah, that might be true, but it's like the fact that that's a factor in whether or not you keep a horse does speak for the fact that the riding is prioritized over having that horse. Like my horses could get career-ending injuries and I could never be able to ride again. And I would not like if Milo injured himself tomorrow in a way where I knew that I would never ever ride him again, I'm not gonna just up and sell him because like him being in my life is more important than being able to ride him because I have him for who he is. And in the past, I haven't done that. And if I look at it now, it's like, yeah, riding at that time was more of a priority. And I can admit that now, but at the time I'd get really defensive because I wanted to feel the way that I felt and make those decisions, but I didn't want to actually have to answer to what the decisions meant.
We also weren't given a model outside of sport and valuing what they can do physically with their bodies to a degree of prowess we're trying to attain. That was the only
Hmm.
model we were given to work in. So if you give
Yeah.
humans another model and way to relate to horses, then they start to value what they can give them without climbing on them equally. But they haven't been
Yes. Because,
given
yeah,
that
I
other
didn't even know what
model.
to do with them when it wasn't riding. Like, it's like I didn't plan anything outside of riding. And it's yeah, it's definitely it's sad because I find that like most kids who are getting into riding horses, they would be absolutely delighted to do anything with them. Like I feel like in a lot of cases they'd have more fun doing the stuff on the ground and like playing with them than they would riding them.
Yeah. Yeah, they really do. I ran programs for kids with all kinds of communication issues and speech delays and stuff. And it was so much fun, and none of it was ridden. And they had as much fun even with the chickens and the stuff around the farm. It's just so rewarding. So there's so many other ways of interacting with horses that we just haven't seen modeled. We talked in the
Hmm.
introduction about it coming from a model of I was taught by cavalry officers. It was a model based on warfare and war
Okay,
preparedness,
yeah.
right? And then sport
Yeah.
and some of my ancestors drove 10 horse hitches and were settling the West. So I mean that team needed to stand the fuck still. Well, they unloaded the timber,
Hmm.
right? Their modus operandi, there was so much pressure on things, and things have evolved into sport, but then there's this,
Hmm.
I think most of the people out there who want to interact with horses that are supporting and carrying the industry are looking for something else that we didn't have modeled, and other
Yes.
ways of interacting with them. So thanks for
And I
giving
do
all
think that's
that.
where some of the frustration comes from too, where like even if they don't know it, I think that that's why people lash out the way that they do because they do want those things. They just don't know how to get them. And then when they see people questioning the way they're currently doing things, there's like I don't know like maybe a level of envy or there's something missing internally that they're not necessarily even aware of yet because I know that I felt that too where it's like you're just it's never fully satisfying to be handling horses the way that you are
Mhm.
no matter how many milestones and goalposts you hit it's just never fully satisfying.
So can you tell me about what started the change? You were a regular in eventing and hunter jumpers and applying all the
I'd never evented. I grew up showing Arabians, then I started getting into hunter jumpers. But like the Arabian circuit was what I grew up learning, and it was like I find breed circuits are kind of like a special type of echo chamber because you don't have people coming from as many different walks of life to share their opinions. So there was a lot of normalized abuse and like stalling the horses and doing like all like really poor management was normalized to me. So basically the biggest change is when like my family could no longer afford to like have me in a regular showing lesson program. And I ended up moving my Arabian to like what people would consider a backyard barn, which was like an all discipline barn where they do a lot of trails, but all the horses were living out 24/7. Um, So the first big shift was when he got introduced to this herd, this horse that I had who was like bolting almost every ride and spooking at everything and so difficult year round, even though he was like a very well-schooled show horse. Basically, overnight became a different horse who's now beginner safe, who I can now take on trail rides, who's not spooky. And it was such a stark difference with only like one change, because at this point I hadn't changed anything about how I ride or train. And it was like very obvious to me where I was like, okay, like clearly this is like what has made the change. So then I started looking into like the science behind it more. And then that got me curious about starting like online classes through the University of Guelph to study equine behavior, and like their physiology, and just like how the horse works. And when I started doing that, I learned about like their digestive system and why they colic way more when stalled. And that shifted my perspective on like the management factors a lot. And then when I started studying behavior, it was after I got my horse Milo, from the SPCA, and I didn't join the behavior class right away. But when I was training him and he didn't want to do something, I would try to respond how I'd always been taught to respond, which is basically just like make them do it. And when I do that, he would literally square up with me. Like he'd be like, oh, he's like,
We're
try,
gonna
try,
tussle. We're
try to
gonna
make
tussle.
me. And yeah, and he'd be like ready to fight. And then I'd never had a horse do that before. So I was just like, whoa,
Yeah.
like I don't know what to do.
You're supposed to back down.
And like exactly. And it just made it worse. It was like pouring gasoline on the fire. The more you tried to make him do something when he was scared and didn't want to, like the worse it would get. He'd either try to fight you or it would just make his behavior escalate drastically. Um, and I never had that before. So then I started studying the behavior of stuff and I learned about like using positive reinforcement with horses, which I'd use to train tricks with my Arabian, but it was never within like a sense of like training regular behaviors. And then that started to really shift my focus. And I still used like a lot of pressure and release, but I softened the amount that I was using drastically. I wasn't like escalating and I wasn't punishing to anywhere near the same extent. And then just the more I learned, the less I needed to try to use like coercive force and like excess punishment, because most of the time it does make things worse, in my opinion, or even in cases where you still get what you want, like it does damage your relationship with the horse. Um, and I didn't want that. And like Milo will do what I ask him to do. Like even where it's like I know there's things that he still doesn't like to do or doesn't want to do. Like if it needs to be done, I can get it done now. Whereas, but like that's also reliant on me not forcing him to do things most of the time. So if it came down to it and there was an emergency and I was like, hey dude, like I need you to like walk through fire for me, like he wouldn't want to do it, but I could like probably make him do it in that setting, but it would be reliant on me not asking him to do that in so many other settings, because then he's learned that like when something really needs to be done, it's important, and that I don't just force him to do stuff willy-nilly. And that was like a big shift. So like he's taught me a lot, because also like I know that he's had trauma, and I know like I don't know everything about his past, but I know quite a lot. And also just seeing like how trauma impacts the way horses think, especially when it happens to them early on in life. And then like I studied human psychology too, and then I started to notice the parallels between like early human psychology and like the trauma, that like childhood trauma, and how it impacts you into your life growing up into adulthood. And I've noticed a lot of parallels. And then with that, like I also like this was much, much later after getting Milo, but I got diagnosed with like ADHD and like autism in my early 20s. And after that, I was kind of like validated in feeling the way that I'd felt for so long, because there was parts of me that like I knew I wasn't like on the same wavelength as a lot of people, but I could never figure out why. And not knowing why kind of led me to thinking there was something like inherently wrong with me. Um, Rather than just like being able to look at it and like because for me like objective facts and like learning more information is like the best course for me to understand things. And like that's also with like other people, one of my biggest frustrations is again not knowing why. And I'll ask people why a lot, and like that's something that I've also found in like our culture, especially if they're older than you. If you ask them why, they take it as like an attempt to like redistribute the hierarchy instead of just curiosity. And like growing up as a kid, I found that a lot, because I'd be asking why. They'd tell me to do something and I'd be like, well, why? Like, why are we doing that? And they don't like it because they want you to just follow instructions. It's not actually about teaching you how to think, it's about teaching you how to obey. Um, and I didn't like that because it's like you can't tell me why. Like, and it's not even that I won't do the thing. It's just like I want to know why. Like, if you can't give me a good reason as to why we're supposed to be following this societal order, like I don't want to do it. Um, and that got me into a lot of trouble as a kid, and it like had teachers single me out when it made them uncomfortable. Some teachers really liked it, and if I look back on it, those teachers are probably more likely to be like the neurodivergent ones, or at least ones who understood neurodivergent children better because they didn't take it as an attack on their authority. But that diagnosis helped me understand myself better and like my thought process better, and it's made it easier to see like why certain people really don't resonate with what I, not that I expect everyone to, but there's like the way in which I think and like see the world is like a massive trigger to some people, and they really, really don't like it. And I've noticed that there's a lot of parallels between like how those people think and how like the teachers and authority figures that responded really viscerally to me being like, why, how they think, because like I question why we do everything the way we do, like even societally and like how everything runs. I'm like, this just doesn't really make sense. And I don't really understand um why so many people are defending like our societal structure to the extent that they do when it doesn't even serve them. And that also makes them mad. So yeah, asking why a lot is also something that's gotten me in trouble. And I think, and I compare that to horses, where it's like when they don't want to do something and they pause, they're kind of being like, why? Like, why should I do this? Or like, I'm scared, I don't understand. And then we punish them for that.
Yes.
And I grew up being treated that way, and I can still think and feel how that made me feel. And it's literally the worst feeling ever. Like, even if you eventually obey, you don't feel good about it.
Yeah.
And yeah, so after kind of drawing all those parallels, it really shifted how I handled horses because I couldn't answer. Like, I started to ask myself, if the only incentive my horse has to do what I ask is escaping discomfort, what incentive do they have to enjoy what I'm asking them to do? And I couldn't answer that question. I still can't answer that question. So after that, I really shifted away from what I was doing because it just wasn't something that I can answer. And honestly, I think a lot of people can't answer that question, and that's why there's so much anger and resentment towards this whole social shift that we're seeing in the horse world. Because internally they know they can't answer it and they're just uncomfortable with the topic because of that.
This is the first person I've ever met that has made the same connections between the labeling and the punishing and looking at the world differently, and sits right in the middle of all this. This is the soup that I like to sit in the middle of. So I'm just thrilled to bits to hear you be so articulate about your experience. If we look at the contracts that we accepted, like older than you, how old are you, Shelby?
I just turned 29.
And I'm 54. So, I mean, there's still affects generations of paradigms that'll be the same coming down. And if we accept these things and are afraid to change, then that's when we lash out and attack. So it's
Yes.
we have similar missions of, to me, once I learned the science, people could argue away their methods and they could blah blah blah, and they could turn their nose up at someone else's way of getting something done with a horse. But once I understood polyvagal theory, there was no going back for
Yeah.
humans. Um, and I thought if people understood that those methods flood a horse's nervous system, right? And that there are, that no matter what you do, if you come in dysregulated, you're not going to work magic with your horse today, sweetheart. There's nothing you can
Mm-hmm.
pay me as your instructor that's going to make your dreams come true today, right?
No.
So I had this moment where I learned about polyvagal theory at a workshop for trauma therapists with Linda Kahanov and Dr. Rebecca Bailey, and have wanted to make it accessible um, to the like, how do you make it accessible to the masses, right? Without hitting shame buttons and turning people off. So it's kind of my mission to find inroads by owning my own learning and being open to training with people like you, much younger than myself, that can get horses to do things because they're choosing to, because they'd rather do what you ask them to do than whatever else today. Um, and understanding that contract, I think, is so important in
Mm-hmm.
the pressure and release world that we work in. If we look at kids like you, kids like um, a couple of mine, and one of my children is more like me, a people pleaser. But the other two, you could apply pressure to all you liked. All you were going to get was like, I will die, right? Death
Yeah.
before submission. And we started colts with that idea that at a certain point they needed to learn to tie up to an unbreakable rope on an unbreakable pole. But we bred an unbreakable colt. Colt like
Mm-hmm.
you, a colt like my son, right? That had no yield in him. He was and athletic enough to break his own neck.
Mm-hmm. Oh
And
no.
so
Yeah.
it's the fallout of something we didn't need to do. We thought
Yeah.
we needed to do it to that horse to make it trainable and tractable to our way of thinking and to teach it to tie up because our thought line was polluted by our beautiful ancestors who did the best they could with what they knew.
Yeah.
But these kids here, like people my age, need to be listening to the Mustang Maddies, and we need to pay attention when people like Shelby piss us off.
Well, yeah, and like I like it's sad because it's like stuff like that where it's like you have stuff that's like avoidable happen and it's like devastating and like I guess this kind of circles back to like me asking people why because I've asked the same thing about like hard tying horses where like oh they need to do this and then it's like well why like what context would a horse need to hard tie in because if they tie well and I've always said this to like the cowboys that I've had defend that I'd be like but if they tie well, you should be able to tie them to like a string and they won't break it because they're not pulling back.
Mhm.
Um, and like you bring a halter everywhere with you because you know that you're going to need it to tie your horse. It's no different to bring a halter and a breakaway strap. Like I would argue that having twine around in most cases is more common than having a halter around. Um, and it's like one of those hard standing traditions that like people can't really explain because their justifications for it don't pass the why test. It's like there's never a context in which that's fully necessary. And like in fact, I would argue that there's not really any reason for horse people to be using non-breakaway equipment anytime. Like, I've even thought about it to the point where it's like I had, a bosal, like a rope, like loping hack more that I liked to hack in, and it had no breakaway strap. So I thought about, and it's all nylon, and I was like, if my horse ever got loose and I fell off for some reason, I could end up killing my horse in this setup um entirely by accident and it wouldn't even necessarily be being an irresponsible owner because you'd go out with that thing expecting that you're not going to fall off or it can even be something as simple as the horse rubs their head on a tree or they're on their leg and they snag it on their boot or something and it's kind of shifted the type of equipment I even use because I'm not worried about my horses running away from me and being unable to be caught if their equipment breaks. Because I'd say 9 times out of 10, I'm gonna be able to catch them because they're not gonna want to run away from me. Um, but yeah, it's one of those really die-hard mindsets where I think, yeah, at its core, it is about submission, where it's like you want your horse to submit to your will. And I think that that's how a lot of people have been reinforced in training where they feel powerful and they feel like a good trainer when they can like make a horse do something. And it's really interesting because I don't think it's particularly hard to get a flight animal that's afraid of basically everything to submit due to like fear or feeling trapped. Until you get like one of the ones like what you're saying, but like those horses stand out because they're kind of an exception to the rule where they're more unusual. And that's why so many people can get away with training a certain way for decades or honestly sometimes even their entire life and not run into those problems because horses that actually fight to that extent are more uncommon because we've specifically bred them so that they don't do that. And uh, that's why like there's not very many of them. But then when you do get one of those horses, it's a situation where it either forces a paradigm shift or you end up having a big accident happening, or you end up getting rid of the horse and being like, this horse is just a problem horse. So it's like, or it can be a combination of all of those too. But it is interesting because they do pop up in people's lives, and ultimately, like how the person learns from those situations is up to them.
Yeah. So a few interesting paradigm shifts I want to help people make today, and things I know you know, I want to pick from your brains now. Um, and that is, tell me about dominance theory. Is that getting debunked?
Yeah, yeah, big time. Because
Okay.
the
What do we
initial
need to know?
study on that was a wolf study, where they were like monitoring the same pack of wolves and like the dynamic between them. And the guy who conducted that study ended up retracting it because essentially what the findings found is that the hierarchical structure was actually like a familial structure where the older wolves were taking on leadership roles and like teaching the younger pups. And those types of dynamics stuck around because they were taking on a teaching role. Um, so it wasn't actually like a hierarchical structure in the sense that there wasn't a fight for dominance. It was an age-related hierarchy where the older dogs or the older wolves were taking on teaching roles. Um, and like dominance theory in general, how people apply it, it's this idea that like horses or dogs are doing things for the purpose of trying to assert their dominance and be the alpha. But if you actually break it down, like with horses, will in particular, the things that we view as like an attempt at dominance are almost always resource guarding. Like even out in the people reference wild herds and they'll be like, oh, but stallions fight. And it's like, if you actually go and watch those herds or talk to any of the photographers and videographers and enthusiasts that spend a lot of time watching them, you would learn that the fights that are so exciting and get shared so much because they're interesting to watch, those happen very infrequently. They're typically very short-lived. And between those fights, there's a lot of time spent coexisting and not fighting and even engaging in like behaviors like mutual grooming and stuff. So like the fights don't speak for like what is normal behavior for horses because horses are harmonious animals that do not want to fight. So most of the time it's resource guarding. When stallions fight, it's usually breeding resources. So they'll be fighting over mares. It might be bachelor stallions trying to enter herds to take mares to start their own herds. And then the fights that ensue are the result of guarding that resource. And then in domesticated herds, we see horses that will like chase each other off of like piles of hay. And that is resource guarding. And people will go, oh, well, there's plenty of hay for all of them. That doesn't matter. All it is a perceived lack of resources. And that can stem from a horse not having constant access to hay throughout their life and developing a food anxiety as a result. It can stem from them being chased off of the food by other horses and having a perceived lack of resources as a result. It doesn't really matter. It's their perception of the resource. It doesn't matter if it is plentiful or not. This tends to be why you don't see horses resource guarding when they're out on pasture as much because the resource is plentiful. It's very uncommon that you'll see a horse chase another horse off of a patch of grass. They might have a distant increasing signal where they move them somewhere else and they take their spot, but it's not going to be to the same intensity. Um, and resources, even like water, can be a thing. So resource guarding is like what we view as dominance in the horse herd. And a lot of times it stems from stress, it stems from a lack of space, it stems from stressors that are imposed by the domesticated lifestyle. So horses being stalled too much, not having enough space to move away from each other, going hours without hay, and then being more desperate to eat it as a result because their stomach hurts. So I would say that most of the really heavy duty resource guarding that we see to the point where people are like seeing their horses beat the crap out of each other, it stems from like a domesticated lifestyle or sudden stressors in the herd. If there's a horse who's more in pain than the rest of the herd, that painful horse is more likely to show resource guarding behaviors because to them, there's going to be a greater perceived lack of resources because since they're in pain, they might view it as them being less able to acquire them.
Yeah.
So, it's not actually dominance. And even with horses with people, if you go into that relationship, when a horse doesn't want to do something, usually it's because they're stressed, they're frustrated, they don't understand, they're scared. Or in cases where it's a repeated behavior, like let's say that what people view as dominance is that their horse bolts and tries to rip the rope out of their hand. what they've learned through trial and error is that if they can effectively turn and bolt the other way, that the person can't hold on to them, and then they get to be freed from the stressor, which is the person. So then that's a learned behavior where they've realized, hey, if I do this, I get away from this thing that is really stressing me out. And it's not at all related to dominance, but people live in a dominance hierarchy, and it's all about status, elitism, like you're so, like how many people like you, how popular you are, how much money you have, how much power you have. And we're in this fixed dominance hierarchy that's largely related to like elitism and like finances and money and like how much social clout people have. And you have to fall into line as a result. And like even within our governments, like living in like the US and Canada, people call this the free world, but it's like not really. Like there's pressures like you're going to be homeless if you can't pay rent. You're going to have to live on the streets. That is what I would call negative reinforcement, where you get the relief of the pressure of like not having access to shelter and food and water when you go to work. It's not, you're not doing it because you want to. And yeah, the money in it is in its essence, you can view it as a reward. It really isn't, because they're giving you just enough to get by in most cases and keep yourself off the street, but not enough to actually relieve yourself from the burden and stress of having to go to work. So we live in a dominance hierarchy. Status really matters to people. We feel like we need to constantly prove ourselves. We feel a need to be powerful, and we project that onto horses. When if you actually look at their social structure and how they function, their entire social structure is rooted in harmony and taking the path of least resistance, which is why it's so easy to get them to do things, because they don't want to fight with us. They don't want to cause problems, and they'll do things even that scare them or that they really, really don't want to do because they don't want to cause problems with us. And
Yeah.
I hate dominance theory because it sets us up to view the horse as like an adversary and like view it through this fighting relationship where it's like the horse didn't sign up to be your adversary. Like I just recorded like a short film and like a poem on this exact topic that I'm going to be releasing like tomorrow or something. But it's a huge pet peeve of mine because it sets people up for failure if you're viewing their interactions through that lens. Because anytime they don't do what you want, you're going to view it as their attempt to like uproot your power structure. When they don't care about that, they just want to feel safe. That's it.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. This is like my wildest dream come true. I went back to school for some social justice courses and stuff. And so to bring social justice together with neurodivergence, with trauma, and with horses is like, pew. This is my nirvana. Hopefully other people want to listen too. This is
Oh, I'm
awesome.
sure. I find a lot of it's like neurodivergent people though, because like or it's
See the
like people who have
connection.
gone, yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for helping debunk the dominance theory that we base so much on. It changes how we walk in the barn, it changes every interaction we have, and it spills into a couple of things. And so I want to hear you speak to the idea of leadership, which we transfer into our horses, or leadership, and when it's based on dominance theory. And there's a tangent I just lost. Damn it, tangent girl. Tangent queen. Um, but if you can kind of grab the ball and run with how these things come together in the horse world.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. So leadership with like viewed through the dominant theory lens is basically just trying to get your horse to submit to like what you want them to do and like obey you. But like I would say leadership and like the partnership role that it's supposed to be should be the person taking on the role of being like the brave person because we're the predator, and like taking on the leadership role where your leadership is about making that horse feel safe and making them feel like they can in your presence, that they're not going to be in danger, that they can be comfortable, that they can be relaxed, and using your leadership role to provide their needs, to advocate for them, and to keep them safe. So it's not necessarily to say that like the horse is like a completely equal partner in that sense, because you have a better understanding of like the threats of the world and like potential factors that can influence their lack of safety or impact their health negatively, and you should use that extra knowledge to try to keep them safer. But it should be a partnership in that there's like communication from either side. Even people who are really buying into dominance theory love to call it a partnership, but if you actually break it down and look at the fact that like the horse's voice is only listened to if they're saying what the person wants to hear, that's not a partnership. You're not always going to hear what you want to hear. you might hear your horse tell you, I really don't like hanging out with you. I have a bad time every time you come down here, and now I want nothing to do with you. And that sucks to hear. But rather than responding from a place of anger and being like, no, you owe me your time and energy, why don't you try to earn it and have the horse want to spend time with you and want to give you that time in their presence rather than making this thing that you try to take by force.
Mm-hmm.
Because the more you can do that and the more choice you can give them where they're opting into the training, they're more likely to say yes, even in situations where you have to like demand from them certain things. Like for a great example of this would be down in LA with all the wildfires. If you have a horse who is afraid of the trailer, and in that emergency setting, you need to demand that they get in the trailer. That is a lot different than literally every single other time you're loading them, including when you're going to a show, because that's not an emergency. You don't need to force them in the trailer just to go to a show. You could be practicing getting them into the trailer of their own accord and rewarding that behavior every other time. And then when an emergency comes around, it'll be substantially easier to demand that they get in the trailer should you need to.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're demanding all the time, then every time they see that trailer, it's going to be an issue where they're expecting to be forced in and have no choice and have no jurisdiction over like what they choose to do. And then it creates an anxiety response that's already starting to climb before they're anywhere near the trailer, just when they notice the pattern. So the leadership role that people should be taking is just like as their horse's advocate and their protector and like a guide to help the horse navigate the world that we've created, but do so in a way where we're using the knowledge that we have and like the level of access that we have to information to make the horse's life better instead of having it be a leadership role that's through an egotistical lens where it's about how we can make the horse do things that best serve like our own interests and what we want to do with them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for helping unpack a lot of that. Um, and so, in your learning, what is something that you couldn't look back from in particular that um, would help someone maybe make this transition from leadership and what it used to look like to them and dominance to this other role? I mean, you people, you young people are having us define leadership differently. Leadership looks different. The relationship feels different. In my own experience, it was a little bit tender when I started giving horses a choice. I wonder if there's anything that stands out to you now that kind of helped to light the way or might help someone make this transition through this
I
awkward
would say a
let and
big thing
go.
is like looking at equipment because the equipment that I used to use that I was told was out of safety, like harsh bits, like a nose chain, a lip chain, um, any type of training gadget or bit that you're like increasing the severity of for the purpose of getting more immediate control. I was taught to view those things as like a safety mechanism to help control unpredictability and keep control of horses who are difficult to handle. And I believed that. But then when I stopped training in as forceful and as punishing of a manner, I realized that like those things are a band-aid fix and they're actually creating the situations that necessitate their use because you're stressing the horse out, you're causing them pain, and you're creating a situation where you need more to control the level of adrenaline and cortisol that's running through their body and making them react a certain way. And so like safety is actually like emotionally regulating your horse. If your horse is emotionally regulated and they're not scared, you don't need to up the harshness of equipment to control them. And you could be leading them around in a flat leather halter and like a something could happen. And even if they get really nervous, it's not going to escalate as quickly, as suddenly, or as intensely. And it makes everything more manageable. Like with my personal horses, I really can't think of a time in the last many years since I made the express choice to stop using equipment as a band-aid where I've felt, oh, I wish I had a nose chain or like I wish I had a harsher bit because instead of throwing on harsher equipment in those moments, like I change what I'm doing and like let's say it's a veterinary related thing. If my horse is being difficult to handle, we're just going to sedate them more and get the procedure done in that emergency situation rather than putting on like a lip chain or something. Or if it's that my horse is being that reactive at a show, I'm gonna scratch my classes and just walk them around the showgrounds in their halter and hand graze them until they settle down. Or take them home and take them to a less busy place next time and work on them there and actually deal with the underlying emotional response that's making them dangerous, because causing them more pain to try to gag a physical response doesn't change the emotional response. So essentially, you're just continuing to teach the horse that these situations are scary and that they're painful and that they're going to be stressful. And you're gagging that physical response while doing nothing to deal with the underlying emotional response that's driving the physical response in the first place. There's nothing more dangerous than a horse who's terrified. Those are the ones that are killing people. Those are the ones that are injuring themselves. Those are the ones that are doing the behaviors that we associate with being the most dangerous and that people encourage punishment for or encourage harsher equipment for. But the actual issue is how the horse is feeling internally. And then that internal feeling is what creates that outward response. So, learning about that aspect has been huge in altering the way that I handle things, because I start to notice the manifestations outwardly of that internal response a lot earlier before they boil over, at which point they're easier to address and you can actually help reduce them. But if you wait until the horse gets to the point where they are freaking out, it's going to be a lot harder to address that, even in like the nice, rewarding way, because they're so scared that they're not going to take food. So you have to start to notice these things earlier, address them earlier on, and then you don't need all of this rough equipment. And I truly, firmly believe that anyone can do this with any horse. It doesn't matter how difficult your horse is. Might take more time for some horses, but like anyone can do this. Anyone can teach their horse to be handleable with less equipment.
Mhm.
And that's a hill that I will die on.
I want to touch on a couple of things within that. One, something I will have to revisit because I've even said relatively recently that a sharper tool is better than having the horse lean and pull through it. And so we were seeing behaviors like a relatively small human and a horse go, yeah, let you lean on this halter. I'm still going to drag you over and do what I want to do. So at the root of it, I was like, well, if you have a rope halter, they won't lean through that. You'll be able to say, no, we're going to the arena, but now you're masking. Yeah. So I'm going to
Like
revisit that Kate. I'm
I would
thinking of one of my
say
students.
in your case, it makes a little bit more sense. Like I would still say in essence, that's like a false dichotomy because there's more than just those two options.
Yeah.
So like when people are using that where they're like, oh, a sharper tool, and then the sharper tool they're referencing is like a twisted wire gag bit.
Yeah.
There's a lot more options than that. Like the rope halter I find is like that's a happy medium where, for example, if you have a child who's not as strong and who won't be able to correct those behaviors in the same way an adult would be able to with experience, or let's say you have an adult who has like wrist problems or a physical issue, in that case you're gonna choose, you could choose something that's a little bit more sharp, but not for the purpose of masking or like abusing the situation to try to create an immediate response for like a fully selfish reason. It's like more practical. But with that said, you could teach the horse to not drag or pull to grass by like essentially like offering like a trade offer. It's kind of like what people do with puppies when they're chewing on your shoe. Rather than punishing them and just taking away the shoe, you give them something else that's valuable to them. And then they learn that it's more valuable to not do the behavior that you don't want them to do and instead defer to a different behavior. So for the horse pulling towards the grass, you could teach them like a vocal cue or even like a tactile aid where you like give them like a half hold on the halter and then immediately click and reward and give them something that's a little bit higher value than the grass. And then throughout time, they're less likely to pull towards the grass. But for a kid to time that properly is probably difficult unless you're always watching them. So in that case, it might be more practical for the kid's safety to use a rope halter. But with that said, in that circumstance, I would never put a kid with a nose chain on a horse because it's just too easy to abuse. And I would just be careful about what I use. So it's not to say that like there's no place for certain types of equipment, but I would say like a rope halter with like just the regular 2 knot rope halter on the nose, not one of the ones with the really studded like nose bands. That is like a happy medium, whereas like a chain noseband or a lip chain or something way more aggressive is almost never necessary. or the cases where it would be necessary, it's like you should never be just like accepting that as your reality for the horse's rest of their life. That there should be an effort to actually alter the behavior so that you aren't relying on causing increased discomfort to create a response.
Yeah. I think you see it a lot in the reality of adrenalized young racehorses. They're
Yeah.
bred and trained to be pumped full of adrenaline and to want to freaking run. And then you've got a human that's trying to lead them around. And so you'll see them a lot in those circumstances, but they should
And
not
it's
be.
super desensitized. Like I used to work at the racetrack, so everyone there is really desensitized to like how aggressive that equipment actually is. And like what I will say is like the last time I picked up a racehorse, which was several years ago now, he'd been stalled 24/7 for like a week and hadn't been getting exercise. So I did lead him to the trailer in a lip chain because I had to walk him across concrete right beside a highway. And it was what he had been getting led around in all before. So that wasn't the time where I was going to change his equipment because I was like, I just need to get him in this trailer safely. And then as soon as he's off the trailer, I can change everything.
Yeah.
Because he's gonna be at the safety of his new place. But I was like, I just need to get him on this trailer safely. So in that circumstance, I would say like I made a choice that I knew was going to be painful. I didn't yank him around in it or abuse it more than it had to be just by being present. But I made a choice where I was like, if this horse gets loose and gets close to the highway or something, then we have a problem. So like this is going to be the last time he ever has to wear a lip chain in his entire life. And I'm not sure how reactive he's going to be as soon as he leaves the stall. So it's like circumstances like that where I would never advocate for the use of lip chains. And in that circumstance, it was like a situation where you could view it as a more emergent circumstance where it's like I had to walk him through the entire backstretch of the racetrack to get to the trailer and load him safely. But like it wasn't a training decision because that's not what I'm regularly going to use in training. I used it as a band-aid in that circumstance just to get him home. So I think it's important to look at things with that nuance. Like I'd say where it becomes a problem is where people are justifying the continued repeated use of something really, really harsh rather than actually addressing the problem. And I think that's where people get lost, where it's like I find that the horse world as a whole, there's a lot of people struggle to see things with nuance. Where if I say like I think lip chains are harsh and they're cruel because like they it is very painful. Um, that doesn't mean that I think every single person who uses one is evil. Like if you're a groom at the racetrack and you're just trying to make a living and you have a horse who's extremely dangerous is trying to kick your head in, really the only more ethical choice you could make that wouldn't completely endanger you would be to quit your job and go work somewhere else. So like it's one of those things where it's like I believe in harm reduction. So if you work at the racetrack, for example, it's like just considering the emotional state the horse is in and why they're reacting that way and not getting mad at them is as a path of harm reduction.
Yeah.
And just being more gentle where you can be and just like trying to help them through that and ideally get them to the point where you could have less equipment. But in that case, it's like it's either your safety or the horse's.
Yeah.
And if they ever get loose, you're the one that gets blamed too. So
Yeah. I so appreciate the nuance that you put into that because it's such a polarized world right now, and that's a lot of the discussion. And our horse sports are in real danger with social license and the power of people putting us under scrutiny right now. And there is room for nuance, and so there's somewhere where you've shown us again some nuance. And another thing that I wanted to grab from earlier was when you were talking about what leadership looks like and feels like, and how it feels like making the horse feel safe and being able to regulate them and co-regulate them. And I wondered if you might touch on how if society as a whole is any indication of the people who are showing up to the barn and they're showing up stressed, how can they help their horse feel like they're competent leaders if their nervous systems aren't regulated? Do you address this in any of the stuff that you do, or?
yeah, like for me, like I think the burnout is a huge factor that like if you're burnt out and you're really stressed and you feel like you need to hit all these markers in your training goals with your horse, then you're way more likely to lose your patience with them. So with people like that, it's like if you're coming to the barn stressed, reduce your criteria. You might be going there to plan to go ride or do a jump school or something, but it's like don't. If you're stressed and you're already having a bad day to the point where if your ride doesn't go well, that it's going to ruin your whole day and that you're going to lose your mind on your horse, just chill with them. Go brush them, go take them for a hand walk, like reduce your criteria, relax. Your horse's training is not going to undo just because you have an inconsistent week, even an inconsistent month. Um, they'll catch back up. And also, even if it did lapse and you lost some fitness, that's not the end of the world. Even if you miss an entire show season, that's not the end of the world. It might feel that way right now, but it really doesn't matter. And if you can learn to like let that stuff go and reduce the importance of it and learn how to enjoy your horse even in the absence of having these constant goals, you'll be a happier person
Mm-hmm.
because horses get injured, you could get injured and you could lose an entire show season or an entire year or even 2 years of riding at any given point or more. And the more you can practice just learning to enjoy horses without having to ride them and constantly be meeting these goals, the happier person you'll be because then your life isn't going to just be derailed when something unexpected happens.
Oh, and like something unexpected never happens with horses.
Yeah, exactly. And
Unexpected's always
yeah.
happening.
Yeah, for me, like I remember how hard I used to cry, like when my horse would have an injury that would mean I couldn't show that season. It was like the end of the world. And then like one of my horses died, and I was like, none of this matters. I was like, it really like a show season, like I looked back at that and it just felt so trivial and insignificant that I was crying about a show season
Mhm.
when it's like way worse things can happen. And that's not really to like compare people's struggles against each other, but it's just I guess a reminder to like humble people a little bit where it's like shows are always going to be there unless we lose our social license. But I mean, that's more of a reason to not be so stuck on producing to the point where we ignore needs of ourselves and our horses. But like that stuff's always it's not going away right now at least. Um so it's like just relax. It's fine. And like if your trainer is stressing you out about that stuff and prioritizing and making it important, what I would encourage people to remember is that that's how trainers make money. So they are going to inflate the importance of things that are paying their bills. And that's not even to just like to crap on the trainers and to like because it's their livelihood, it's their career. That makes sense. If that's how they're primarily making their money, they do have a reason to view that with importance and for it to bother them, but that doesn't mean that you need to maintain that importance for yourself. And ultimately, it's their job to help supplement their own income to adjust accordingly with their clients' needs. And as much as it sucks, it's like if you're trying to train in a more ethical manner, you are going to lose money, just to put it frankly, because you make the most money when you don't care about the extents that you're pushing your horses or your clients to. Because you don't have to take breaks and it's not healthy. And that's why I've really stepped back from taking on regular clients other than like a very select few types of clients because like it was eating away at me like what I actually had to do to make money and like also like if I did do the right thing and took the moral path, having to cope with that loss of revenue and find out a different means of making that money was really hard. And I was like, this just really isn't worth the hassle because also sometimes clients fight you on it. If I'm like, hey, your horse is lame. And it's not like it's a very obvious lameness that they can clearly see. It's like, no, this is like a chronic discomfort and I'm not comfortable working your horse in this condition. And if they don't want to call the vet, it's like my only option is to be like, okay, you're right. I'm going to keep doing this. Or to just be like, no, find someone else.
Yeah.
Um, and that's what I started doing because a huge portion of horses are not sound. So
Yeah, and we've normalized things. So one of the things I wanted to tease out is the word behavior, because I think in so many of our heads, a behavior is something that we don't want, that we want to change. And that isn't how behaviorists describe behavior and influence it at all. So I wanted to tease out the idea that a lot of the behaviors we see are actually opinions. And
mhm.
the four methods we have of influencing behaviors we want to see. So if I can let you run with that a little bit.
So yeah, for behaviors that we want to see, like you want to reinforce the behaviors you want to see. And like what I see in horse training actually is like a lot of people are more focused on what they don't want to see and like punishing what they don't want to see rather than like rewarding what they want to see. And it puts your horse in a really inconvenient position where most of the time they're experiencing like discomfort and being told what not to do or being nagged into doing something rather than doing the right thing and having you be like, yes, good job. Here's something you find valuable. And that's what I would recommend the most is like if you want your horse to do behaviors more, make them really, really reinforcing and make it the best thing that the horse could possibly do and focus on what the right thing is and rewarding the correct behavior rather than focusing on the unwanted behaviors and punishing those because it just sets up a really like negative environment for the horse where there's way too much focus on them doing the wrong thing rather than encouraging what the right things are to do. And that's something that I think a lot of people get stuck on too, where they think that if you don't punish the wrong behaviors, that the horse is just going to walk all over you. But it's like if there's conflicting behaviors that you're rewarding that the horse cannot do at the same time as the wrong behavior, whatever the more valuable behavior is going to be the one that sticks. So if you can make the correct behavior more valuable than the incorrect one, they're more likely to do that. And then also a lot of unwanted behaviors stem from underlying feelings and emotions and like horses trying to communicate how they're feeling. So if you address why they are doing that, they'll stop doing that behavior because the purpose that that behavior is fulfilling is now met already. So they don't need to show you that behavior. And that's what I would recommend because it makes training a lot more fun for the horse.
Mm-hmm. And in scientific studies, can you tell me something about the effectiveness of punishment?
It's not very effective. In the moment, it's effective in stopping in the moment, but the behavior almost always reoccurs unless the underlying motive of the behavior is met. Um, and the risk factors for positive punishment are so high where you get a lot of fallout behavior, you get a lot of anxiety. The horse is less likely to trial new behaviors when trying to seek the correct behavior, which is a huge like that's a huge negative because
Right.
if your horse isn't going to trial new behaviors in fear of punishment, they're going to have a harder time finding the right answer. And you want them to be looking for what the correct behavior is. But if you think about it practically, if you run the risk of getting slapped across the face if you say or do the wrong thing, and you don't know what the right thing is and you don't know what the wrong things are, you're probably not going to say anything. And like I did this in school too. Teachers used to humiliate me. If I said the wrong thing or if I didn't say what they were wanting. And that was enough of a punishment where I just chose to say nothing. And there was a lot of times where I actually had the right answer and I never said it because I was too scared of punishment. Horses are not much different.
Yeah. Yeah. No, not at all. So I wanted to tease out a little bit of the language that people get hung up on. So you said positive punishment. So we've got R positive, R negative, R, and I just want to tease out the definitions of um, what those four categories are.
So when like we're referencing the quadrants of operant conditioning, negative just refers to the removal of a stimulus. So it might be easier for people to think of it like subtractive and then additive. So positive is the addition of a stimulus. So that
Yeah.
would be like additive. So for positive punishment, it's not saying like good punishment. It's saying that you're adding a stimulus that is punishing, which for horses in most cases is going to be hitting them. But it could also be yelling at them. It could be backing them up suddenly, chasing them in a circle. Anything that they find really unpleasant that's a stimulus that you're adding would be positive punishment. And then positive reinforcement by default has to be adding something that they find reinforcing. If the horse doesn't find it reinforcing, it's not going to be positively reinforcing. So that's the important thing is it can vary from horse to horse. If your horse doesn't like apples, trying to give them an apple for the right behavior is not going to be rewarding.
Thanks for teasing out the difference, because people get really hung up on that. And so if I can say having applied the principles of our positive training, positive reinforcement training. I followed Mustang Maddie's 20-week course, and they were really strict about how to deliver the treats and whatnot. That there is room for it in everybody's program. And people don't need to worry about mugging.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, I think one of the things that really teased out was the timing of it. So in the clicker training world, the moment they start thinking about and doing the behavior, you mark that moment. And I think when we apply pressure and release, often we're just so past the point where they did the thing and started to do the thing we wanted them to do, that's a really good crossover from the clicker training world to the pressure and release world that you
Yes.
carry
Yeah,
over.
it helps your timing with any reinforcer if you start to become more conscious of that,
Yeah.
when to mark the behavior.
Yeah. And so I wondered if you had any other things to share for people that haven't done this positive reinforcement stuff. Maybe they've been afraid to try, baiting them with treats and they're mugging. Do you have some advice for the beginning of and how it's going to help them?
Important thing would be to mark the behavior, because that's people not marking the behavior is where you run into the problems with mugging, because between the time of the horse doing the behavior you want and you reaching into your pockets to feed them a treat, they could be turning towards you and starting to go towards your pockets, and then that's what you're reinforcing if you don't have a marker behavior. I mean, a marker cue. Um, so teaching them like a bridge signal, which can be like a physical clicker that you press the button on. It can be the tongue pop, or it can just be like yes, like that's my dog's marker cue. It's just yes, because I try to use different ones with different animals so that I don't confuse anyone.
Oh, yeah.
um
Thanks for
so
that.
yeah.
Dogs around the
Yeah.
barn. Thank you.
Yeah. So you just want to make sure that it's like the same tone and the same relative set. Like some people are way more strict where they're like, I only want to use a clicker because the tone can slightly differ. Personally, for me, like I find that they learn it well enough that even if the tone is slightly like, unless you're singing at a completely different pitch or in different syllables or something, like they're still gonna get it. Like my horses know the tongue pop and the button clicker. They can learn more than one marker cue too. Um, but teaching them that will teach them like when they're actually being reinforced. Otherwise, like without that marker cue, you're going to be feeding them, and that moment of you presenting the treat is going to be what's reinforcing. And then that leaves way too much of a window for them to do the wrong behavior and for you to be reinforcing the wrong thing. Whereas with the marker signal, once they learn it, you have a really concise, succinct way to mark the exact behavior. And then the other thing too, like the easiest way to teach the marker cue from the beginning is to teach it in tandem with teaching them the neutral head position, which is essentially just teaching them to face forward and away from you. And then you're clicking, reinforcing them every time their head is facing forward and away from you. And they can't be mugging you and facing forward and away from you at the same time. Those are two conflicting behaviors. Um, so when you do that, they learn not to mug you, they learn the bridge signal, and then you can get started teaching them like anything else. The next behavior that I would usually recommend teaching after that would be target training, because there's a lot of things that you can teach from target training. You can teach them like liberty work from that. You can teach them trailer loading skills at liberty. You can teach them like tons and tons of stuff. Like it's a really great way to teach them how to offer movement um without having to add pressure. So like even for when starting horses under saddle, it's a really good way to, with positive reinforcement, teach them to walk forward, and then you just link that to a tactile cue, which is like putting your leg on them. And now you have a cue that looks identical to one taught with pressure and release, but that wasn't taught with pressure and release. And I think that's where a lot of people also get confused, where they think that if you apply a tactile aid and then release it when the horse has done the cue, the behavior that you're asking for, they think that that's pressure and release because technically you're applying pressure and releasing it. But the key difference when it's taught with positive reinforcement is that what actually elicited the behavioral response is already a conditioned signal, like following the target stick, and all you're doing is linking it to the tactile cue. So that's all it is, it's a tactile cue. Whereas on the flip side, when you're teaching with negative reinforcement, and you're not using any type of reward based thing to get the horse to move forward first, you're just tapping them with your legs until they move, and then when they move you're releasing that movement, in which case the reinforcing thing is the release of the pressure because you've irritated them into moving away. That doesn't mean that you have to cause them pain or like boot them to get them to move, but what they have done is they've tried to move away from a pressure that they would prefer not be present, and then you stop the pressure at that point. So that's the key difference. The tactile cue and the positive reinforcement way, if you were to just apply that tactile cue without any rewards based preconditioned behavior, the horse wouldn't move. They just stand there because it's a neutral pressure stimulus. They don't care about it. It's not irritating them to the point where they need to move. Um, So that's the key difference. So it's not about like if you train positive reinforcement, it's not about never having any tactile cues. And I think that's a really common misconception.
Thanks for, yeah, clearing that up and bridging the gap of how you make it different than pressure and release, and yet use a tactile cue.
Yeah.
Yeah, like a
Yeah,
leg.
and the key is like not all pressure is aversive. Like you'll know if it's aversive if the horse tries to move away from it. But if it's a tactile cue that they you can just apply and they stand there until you give it meaning, then it's not aversive because it's not bothering them enough to move away from it.
No, it's kinds of, it blows people's mind when I tell them that, like, putting your leg on your horse's side behind the girth and pushing it into their side, it's not natural for a horse to go, oh, and yield away from it. It's actually natural for them to push back into it. It's
Yeah,
like their natural response. And that they could use something else as a cue, and so to kind of shake up how they think. About what they've accepted as, well, we put our leg there and we apply pressure, and yeah, there's so many other things we can do to motivate their behavior and to draw attention to what we want. And yeah.
for
Do
sure.
do you have anything else you wish gets out to the world before we wrap it up today? Something that stands out to you?
I would just say like one of the best skills that I think would be transferable to like everything in horsemanship is to like learn how to be so confident in your ability to learn and like what you believe in and your ability to apply it and your ability to adjust and change as needed, that you don't rely on external validation to make those decisions. Because I find that that's where people get defensive, where when someone disagrees with the perspective they've built of the horse world, they're insecure enough in that perspective that it really throws them for a loop when someone like myself says like stalling horses 24/7 is bad, and it ruins their whole day. They feel the need to defend themselves and plead their case because they're not secure in it. Whereas if you're secure in your care, you don't need to do that. Like I can say what I want, and when people who have their horses in show barns are like, your horses live in the mud, I'm like, well, they're happy. Like I would never send any of my horses to live in those people's barns because I know it would damage their welfare, and that's something that I am sure of. Um, and so I don't need that external validation. And like this is like it doesn't mean that you have to do things the same way as me, but it's like if you are insecure in your perspectives on things, it won't take very much to derail them and to make you feel really uncomfortable when people have opposing views. So you want to get to the point where you are self-assured enough that you don't need external validation from random people, that you have your core group of people who you can look to as guides and ask for advice, and whose advice that you can trust and who you can trust to support you, to call you out on stuff when you need it, to check you on things, to advocate for you. And and they don't necessarily need to be people that you're physically with. It can be an online group. Like I started an online support group for people who are wanting to learn about positive reinforcement or who are transitioning to the use of it. And it's really great because people who don't have any local community in rewards-based training and who are feeling insecure because of that can post, and they can get advice, and they can get people to give them support that they're not getting in person. So it doesn't need to be like in-person people, but it's like I would encourage people to feel self-assured enough that it's not going to derail you and cause you to shift your belief system to people please, because even if it provides you some level of comfort in that state of discomfort with that person, internally you're going to feel the damage that that does, and it's going to continue eating away at you. And similarly, if you see posts that are bothering you, that are making you question your practices and that you're trying to defend yourself against, even if you're telling yourself that that person is wrong and that they're full of crap and that you don't believe them, if it's bothering you to that point, it's going to internally eat away at you regardless. So, developing that level of self-assurance and where you can validate yourself and you can feel good about yourself and you can learn that one, you're never going to be liked by everyone, no matter what you do, no matter how much you try to people please. You could try to be the person that you think everyone wants. You're still not going to be liked by everyone. So it's like you just got to learn to cope with that and deal with it and realize that not everyone's going to be liked by you. It's like, do you like everyone? No, you don't necessarily have to have a reason to. They don't need to be a bad person. They don't need to be a mean person. There doesn't need to be anything wrong with them. You don't need to hate them. You could just not like their vibe. And you can understand that they're a nice person. You could be like, this person's a good person, but they're not for me. Um, And that's okay because we're never gonna like everyone. It's like I love all animals. There's certain breeds of dogs that I would never, ever, ever want in my house as my dog. And it doesn't mean that I'm not acknowledging the fact that they're probably nice dogs with nice personalities. They're just not for me. They're just not my type of dog. And it's this like not to compare people to dogs, but also kind of where it's like some personalities just don't match. They're just not for you. Sometimes people are too high energy, they're too low energy, or you just have different perspectives that just can't be rectified. So learn how to cope with people not liking you, learn how to validate yourself, and learn how to get comfortable with like your own ability to grow and learn, which is a huge one I would say that comes with self-validation is like now that I've had like my life kind of fall apart in the horse world sense where everything I believed crumbled and I realized how wrong it was and I had to change and rebuild. Now that I've done that, like I'm not afraid of that happening again if it needs to. I know that I can do it again. And so I can cope if information comes out that alters what I currently believe. And like let's say new science came out that's like actually horses love their stalls and they love being punished. I could accept that if if it were actually credible. It's not going to happen because of how much information there is in the opposite direction. Um, but if something like that were to happen, like I can handle being proven wrong because it's already happened on such a wide degree. And like I would also say that's another thing with like self-validation is like own your flaws, own where you've gone wrong, and like just highlight it to everyone. Because the people who are trying to tear you down, if you could just go like, yeah, you're right, I did do things badly back then, and you just like it derails them. It takes the wind out of their sails if they're trying to shut you down and to make you feel bad about yourself. Suddenly you've completely deflated their ability to do that because you're acknowledging that. And it makes it less fun. But when you're like really defensive and you get like, you're like, oh, like now I feel like a bad person. That's exactly what the people want. Like when you just go like, yeah, like I've already done that, like whatever, or you just don't agree with them and like think what you want. You can think whatever you want of me. Like I know who I am. Because
Mhm.
like that's the other thing is no one knows who you are more than you do yourself. So
Mhm.
don't let people tell you who you are
Yeah.
because you know who you are. And again, it all comes back to like external, not seeking external validation and just learning how to be validated within yourself and find like the right people to have in your close life. And it doesn't need to be a lot of people, it just needs to be quality people. Or even person. You could have one really high quality person in your life, and that's better than having a crowd of people that actually aren't really cheering you on.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Find your people. And the one thing I wanted to like pluck out of this that we've mentioned a bunch of time is the stabling. And it's common because we're lacking land in so many places. And it's common because they say, well, it's a show horse and they must
Mm-hmm.
be. But as someone who showed horses to the international level of eventing and was raised by a cowboy who believed in turnout,
Yeah. Oh, that's so
my
awesome.
my mom and I snuck O'Reilly into 24-hour-a-day turnout situations everywhere we went with the team. I got in shit every day of the week. So I wasn't always a people pleaser. I have an inability to really just tell untruths and lie. So at jog up every day of training camp when we were getting ready for the 92 Olympics in England, I would come first and present my horse and take my earful. Did you turn him out last night? Yes, I did. Oh, he'd rage at me, and by the end, he was throwing his cigarette and his hat and like and blaming everything that was going wrong with this little horse with his access to turnout.
That's so crazy.
And the reason why he was not feeling well and he had low blood cell count and all kinds of things had absolutely nothing to do with the fact that he had an idyllic English paddock with a few sheep and some geese in it
Yeah.
and shelter, and I was supposed to lock him up. So when we traveled, there were a few of us that would find horses that traveled together, could buddy together, or go and turn out beside each other and find ways to give them what they needed. Or my mom, Keitha, was on the end of a lead rope constantly at
Aw.
competitions, and there are ways to accommodate. We don't have to accept the 24-hour day
Yeah.
because we're
And
showing.
even if you can't change it immediately, it's like, yeah, taking them for walks and being
Yeah.
at the barn more and just doing stuff. Like, it's like do what you can in the immediate moment for harm reduction and don't self disable by looking at what you can't do instead of looking at what you can do. And I find that's what a lot of people do to try to derail the discussions about need for turnout, is they look at their limitations instead of what they actually can do. And I would say in most cases, in most areas, you could travel a little further and find a better place. You could get to the barn more, you could get more enrichment, you could make the stall walls half walls so your horses can groom over them. You can look for private barns that aren't advertising because they're just people's houses, and see if anyone needs a companion for their horse. Like, there are truly lots more options than people make it out to be, because like I think people get the impression that like I live in the middle of nowhere, when like I'm really close to the biggest city in British Columbia. Like, I'm within 40 minutes of Vancouver. And everything's getting urbanized here, and like it is hard to find good turnout, but it's out there. If you look for it, it just might require some sacrifice, like not having an indoor arena, which I haven't had one in, I don't even, like, maybe a decade plus now, no longer than that. I haven't had one in like 15 years.
Yeah,
And
I
it's
didn't
like,
grow
it's
up with
not that
one.
big of a deal. It's
Yeah,
not.
I
It
didn't
feels
grow
like
up with
one.
one, and I grew up in Northern Ontario, and I thought of it as a
Yeah,
hardship
that's
at the
right.
time. So as a teenager, like, oh, poor me, I don't have an indoor arena. But my
Yeah.
horses had a blast. They worked outside in the
Yeah.
snow. I shod for it. I had to spend some money on special shoeing to accommodate.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
the
there's
thing,
definitely pros and cons,
yeah,
but it's worth it. It's
yeah.
worth it.
Well, thanks very much for your time today.
Yeah,
It's
thank you for
definitely
having
worth
me.
getting the word out about these things and changing how people think about horses. And
For sure. Yeah, no, I love talking about these things, so that's great.
yeah, thanks for
Yeah.
influencing change.
Yeah,
Appreciate
thank you. I'm trying.
you. And I'll let you know when I get it edited and out to the world.
Perfect. Yeah, I'll share it when you do.
Super. Thank you, Shelby.
Yeah, thank you. Have a good day.
You too. Bye.
Bye.
Hey, you're still here. Thanks so much for listening. What you think and feel matters. If this resonated with you, please like and share. It truly makes a difference. I encourage you to engage with the content on my Substack account and my socials, all at The Magic of Horsecraft, where you can join the discussion and shape the future shows. Tell me what you want to hear more of or less of, and we'll evolve together as we grow a community of like-minded souls here for the good of the horse. If you're an adult amateur horse lover looking for confidence and clarity in your role of equine steward, check out my course, From Amateur to Magician, Making Magic with Horses, at themagicofhorsecraft.com. Until then, I'm here to remind you of a couple things. One, underneath it all, we all want the same things: to be heard, understood, and accepted for who we are. And two, anything is possible. Take a chance.